He was the last English king to die in battle, depicted by Shakespeare as a scheming hunchback. Richard III was killed in 1485, and the whereabouts of his body has been a mystery for centuries.
A parking lot, a skeleton, and a DNA test that destroyed 500 years of royal history. When scientists finally found King Richard III, they thought the mystery was over. They were wrong. What they discovered in his DNA was so shocking, so scandalous, that it exposed a truth powerful families never wanted revealed. The bloodline was broken. The legitimacy was fake. And if it happened to him, it could have happened to any royal family in history. What they found will make you question everything you thought you knew about kings and queens. In August of 2012, a team of archaeologists stood in one of the most unlikely places imaginable for a major historical discovery.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is the academic conclusion of the University of Leicester that beyond reasonable doubt, the individual exhumed at Greyfriars in September 2012 is indeed Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England.
They weren't in some grand cathedral or ancient burial ground. Instead, they found themselves in a mundane city council parking lot in Leicester, England. The tarmac beneath their feet covered what they believed to be one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in British history, the final resting place of King Richard III. For more than 5 centuries, nobody knew exactly where this monarch was buried. The story goes that Richard died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, making him the last English king to die in combat. After the battle, his body was brought to Leicester, stripped of its armor and clothing, and buried in a church known as the Greyfriars. But that's where the certainty ends and the mystery begins. Over the following centuries, England went through massive changes. The church where Richard was supposedly buried didn't survive. During the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s, Greyfriars was torn down. Its stones were taken away and reused for other buildings, a common practice at the time. The land was built over, redeveloped, and eventually lost all connection to its past. The exact location of the church, and therefore the king's grave, simply vanished from memory. Local legends filled the gap left by historical records. Some stories claim that Richard's bones had been dug up during the Reformation and thrown into the nearby River Soar. It was a colorful tale, but there was no real evidence to support it. Most historians assumed that even if his remains were still in Leicester, they were lost forever beneath centuries of urban development. The chances of finding a single grave from the 15th century seemed impossibly slim. But a small group of people refused to give up. The Richard III Society, a group dedicated to reassessing the king's reputation, had long believed the burial site could be found. They joined forces with archaeologists from the University of Leicester, and together they began piecing together historical maps and documents. These old records showed roughly where Greyfriars had stood. When they overlaid these maps onto modern Leicester, one location kept coming up: a car park belonging to the City Council's Social Services Department. It sounds almost ridiculous. The idea that a king of England might be buried under a parking space marked with painted white lines seems like something from a comedy sketch. Yet the research kept pointing to this exact spot. Eventually, the team secured funding and permission to dig. They knew it was a long shot, but the historical evidence was compelling enough to try. On the very first day of excavation, they made a discovery. Just beneath the surface, they found human leg bones. The team's excitement must have been overwhelming, but they had to remain careful and methodical. Finding human remains in an old part of a city isn't that unusual. Medieval England had churches and burial grounds all over the place. These bones could belong to anyone from any period. As the archaeologists carefully excavated the skeleton, officially labeled as Skeleton 1, they noticed something immediately striking. The grave itself was oddly constructed. It was too short for the body it contained, forcing whoever was buried there into an awkward position. The head was propped up at an uncomfortable angle because there simply wasn't enough room. This wasn't the careful, respectful burial you'd expect for a king. It looked hasty, almost careless, as if whoever dug it was in a hurry or didn't particularly care about the dignity of the deceased. The skeleton belonged to an adult male, and as the team examined it more closely, they found evidence of a violent death. The bones bore the marks of numerous injuries, 10 in total. 8 of these wounds were concentrated on the skull, which immediately suggested something significant. In medieval warfare, warriors wore helmets for protection. Multiple head wounds meant this person's helmet had either been lost during the fight or deliberately removed afterward. 2 of the skull injuries were particularly severe. Either one would have been fatal on its own. One was a sharp force trauma to the base of the skull, the kind of injury consistent with a sword blow. The other was even more disturbing, a large puncture wound that went straight through the top of the head. Weapons experts identified this as likely coming from a halberd, a type of pole arm that combined an axe blade with a spike. Someone had struck this person from above with tremendous force, driving the weapon through bone and into the brain. These weren't the wounds of someone who died quickly in the chaos of battle. They painted a picture of someone who had been brought down, surrounded, and then subjected to a concentrated attack. The pattern suggested a very personal, almost frenzied assault. But the detail that really made the archaeologists' hearts race was something else entirely. The skeleton had a severe curvature of the spine, a condition known as scoliosis. The twist was pronounced, running through the upper back and causing a significant deformity. This would have had visible effects on the person's appearance in life. Their right shoulder would have sat noticeably higher than their left, and their torso would have appeared shorter than normal. For anyone familiar with English history, this detail was electric. Richard III had been depicted for centuries as having a deformed back. William Shakespeare's famous play portrayed him as a hunchback, a physical monster to match his supposedly villainous character. Tudor propaganda had painted Richard as physically twisted and morally corrupt. Most modern historians assume this was pure propaganda, an exaggeration designed to justify the Tudor claim to the throne after they defeated Richard. Yet here was a skeleton with actual spinal deformity. The reality was more nuanced than Shakespeare's portrayal, but there was a real medical condition underlying the historical accounts. The curvature wouldn't have created the dramatic hump that Shakespeare described, but it would have been visible to anyone who knew Richard. Additional analysis added more pieces to the puzzle. Scientists examined the isotopes in the teeth and bones, which can reveal information about diet. The results showed this person had eaten a diet rich in seafood and had regularly consumed wine. In 15th century England, this kind of diet was expensive. Only someone of high social status could afford to eat this way consistently. Every piece of evidence seemed to fit. The location matched the historical records of where Richard was buried. The age of the skeleton matched Richard's age at death, which was 32. The injuries matched the accounts of a king who died in battle, surrounded by enemies. The spinal condition matched the physical descriptions, however exaggerated, that had followed Richard through history. The diet matched someone of royal status. Yet despite all this compelling circumstantial evidence, the archaeologists knew they needed absolute proof. Bones and battle wounds in medieval graves could potentially be coincidental. To declare with certainty that they had found Richard III, they needed something that couldn't be disputed or explained away. They needed to look inside the very building blocks of the body itself. They needed DNA evidence that would connect these 500-year-old bones to living people today. The search for genetic proof was about to begin, and it would reveal far more than anyone expected. With a skeleton that could potentially be a king lying in their laboratory, the scientific team faced an enormous challenge. Extracting usable DNA from bones that have spent more than 5 centuries underground is extraordinarily difficult. It's not like testing DNA from a living person where you can simply swab the inside of a cheek. Ancient DNA breaks down over time, fragmenting into thousands of tiny pieces. The longer it's been since death, the more degraded the genetic material becomes. What makes it even harder is contamination. Every person who handles the bones, every archaeologist who brushes away dirt, every scientist who examines the skeleton, leaves behind traces of their own DNA. Modern DNA is much better preserved than ancient DNA, so it can easily overwhelm the samples and create false results. The team had to take extreme precautions. They worked in specially designed clean rooms, wearing full protective suits, masks, and gloves. Every tool was sterilized. Every surface was cleaned repeatedly. They couldn't risk a single skin cell or drop of sweat contaminating their precious samples. The scientists carefully selected which bones to test. They chose a tooth and the femur, which is the large thigh bone. These are considered the best places to find preserved genetic material in old skeletons. Teeth are particularly good because the enamel provides a protective shell, and dense leg bones like the femur are less porous than other bones, making them more resistant to degradation. Using specialized drills, they extracted tiny samples from deep inside these bones, where contamination was least likely to have penetrated. The question now was what to do with this ancient DNA. You can't simply compare it to any random person and expect a match. The team needed to find living relatives of Richard III, which presented its own set of challenges. Richard died without any surviving children, so there were no direct descendants to test. The scientists had to think creatively about how genetic inheritance works. This is where mitochondrial DNA, often shortened to mTDNA, becomes crucial. Most of our DNA is a mixture of both parents. Each generation shuffles the genetic deck, so to speak, combining DNA from the mother and father in new ways. This makes it difficult to trace family lines over many generations because the DNA changes too much. However, mitochondrial DNA is different. It's a special type of DNA that lives outside the cell nucleus, in structures called mitochondria. These are the parts of cells that produce energy. The remarkable thing about mitochondrial DNA is that it passes down exclusively through the maternal line. A mother passes her mtDNA to all her children, both sons and daughters. But only the daughters can pass it on to the next generation. Sons inherit their mother's mtDNA, but don't transmit it to their own children. This means that mitochondrial DNA remains almost unchanged as it travels down through the generations, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, and so on. It's like a genetic signature that marks a family line. For the scientists looking for Richard III's relatives, this was perfect. Even though Richard had no children, he had siblings. His older sister was Anne of York, who lived in the mid-15th century. Anne had children, and her daughters had children, and that maternal line continued down through the centuries. If the team could trace Anne's descendants through the female line all the way to the present day, they could find people who should have the same mitochondrial DNA as Richard. This wasn't easy. It required genealogists to work through centuries of family records, birth certificates, marriage records, and historical documents. They had to trace each generation carefully, making sure they followed only the female line. A single mistake, one wrong turn in the family tree, and the whole effort would be worthless. The research took years of painstaking work. Eventually, they succeeded. The genealogists identified 2 living people who were direct maternal line descendants of Anne of York. One was Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker who was living in London at the time. The other was Wendy Doldig, a distant cousin living elsewhere. Both agreed to provide DNA samples for testing. They simply had to give a saliva sample or a cheek swab, a routine and painless procedure. Their DNA could then be compared to the DNA extracted from the skeleton in the car park. The laboratory work took time. The ancient DNA had to be carefully sequenced, which means reading the order of the genetic code letter by letter. The modern DNA samples from Michael Ibsen and Wendy Doldig underwent the same process. Then the results were compared. The team was looking for a match in the mitochondrial DNA sequence. When the results came back, they were definitive. The mitochondrial DNA from the 500-year-old skeleton was a perfect match to Michael Ibsen's DNA, not just similar, but identical in the sections they examined. This wasn't a common type of mitochondrial DNA either. The specific sequence they all shared is actually quite rare in the general population, found in only a small percentage of people. The statistical probability of this being a coincidence was astronomically low. Scientists always think in terms of probability rather than absolute certainty. But this was as close to certain as genetics can get. The odds overwhelmingly favored one conclusion. The skeleton in the Leicester car park was Richard III. Combined with all the other evidence, the archaeological context, the location, the age of the skeleton, the battle wounds, the spinal curvature, and the high-status diet, the genetic match sealed the case. The announcement was made in February 2013, and it created a sensation. News outlets around the world reported the discovery. After more than 5 centuries, one of England's most controversial kings had been found. The mystery that had puzzled historians for generations was solved. Richard III had been lying beneath a car park all along, not thrown into a river as the legends claimed. The University of Leicester held press conferences. Documentary makers rushed to tell the story. Michael Ibsen, who had been living a quiet life making furniture, suddenly found himself at the center of international attention as the genetic link to a medieval king. For many people, this was the end of the story. The king was found, identified, and could now be properly reburied with the dignity befitting a monarch. Plans were made for a formal reinterment at Leicester Cathedral. It seemed like a satisfying conclusion to a historical mystery. The scientists had done their job brilliantly, using cutting-edge DNA technology to solve a puzzle that had lasted for centuries. But the research team wasn't finished. Mitochondrial DNA had confirmed the identity. But there was another type of genetic test they could perform. They had extracted nuclear DNA from the skeleton as well, not just mitochondrial DNA. Nuclear DNA contains far more information, including the Y chromosome. This is the chromosome that determines biological male sex, and it has a very specific inheritance pattern. Unlike mitochondrial DNA, which passes through mothers, the Y chromosome passes from father to son, remaining largely unchanged through the male line. The scientists realized they could use the Y chromosome as a second test. If they could find living men who descended from Richard III's male line ancestors, those men should have a Y chromosome that matched Richard's. It would be another confirmation, another piece of genetic proof. The genealogists went back to their family trees and started tracing male line descendants from Edward III, who was Richard's great-great-grandfather. They identified several living men from the Somerset family, specifically descendants of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort. These men agreed to provide DNA samples. The testing was done. The Y chromosomes were sequenced and compared. The scientists examined the results and found something they weren't expecting at all. The Y chromosomes didn't match, not even close. There was a complete mismatch between Richard III's Y chromosome and the Y chromosomes of the modern descendants. Somewhere in the 19 generations between Edward III and the present day, the male line had been broken. Someone's biological father was not the man recorded in the family tree. The celebration was about to turn into something much more complicated. A genetic bombshell was about to explode, revealing a scandal that had been hidden for centuries. The Y chromosome results sent shockwaves through the historical and scientific communities. This wasn't just an unexpected finding or a minor anomaly in the data. It was a fundamental impossibility, according to the official family records. The DNA was telling a clear story. Somewhere in the chain of fathers and sons connecting Richard III to his supposed ancestors, there had been what scientists politely call a false paternity event. In simpler terms, someone had a biological father who wasn't the man everyone believed was the father. To understand why this matters so much, you need to understand how medieval royal power worked. The entire legitimacy of kings and queens rested on bloodlines. The right to rule wasn't based on elections or merit or popular support. It was based entirely on being born to the right parents. The Plantagenet dynasty, which included Richard III, justified their hold on the English throne through an unbroken line of succession stretching back generations. Every king claimed authority because his father had been king and his father before him and so on. The bloodline was everything. This DNA evidence proved that the bloodline wasn't pure. At some point, a noblewoman had conceived a child with someone other than her husband. That child was raised as legitimate, inherited titles and wealth, and passed on what everyone believed was the family bloodline. But genetically, the line had been broken. The child carried different DNA than the official family tree suggested. What made this discovery particularly explosive was its implications for royal legitimacy. If the break happened in Richard's direct line, it could mean that Richard himself had no biological claim to the throne he fought for. If it happened in another branch of the family, it still demolished the idea that royal bloodlines were sacred and pure. Either way, it exposed the concept of dynastic succession as built on a foundation that could be, and apparently was, compromised by very human behavior. The scientists faced a difficult question. Where exactly did the break occur? The Y chromosome passes from father to son relatively unchanged, so a mismatch means the break happened somewhere between Richard III and his ancestor Edward III, or somewhere in the line leading to the modern Somerset descendants. That's 19 generations to search through, spanning more than 6 centuries. Pinpointing the exact generation where the false paternity occurred is nearly impossible without testing DNA from people who died centuries ago. Several theories emerged, each with dramatic implications. One of the most controversial suggestions was that the break happened in Richard's own immediate family. There had been rumors even during Richard's lifetime about his father. Richard's father was Richard, Duke of York, a powerful nobleman who claimed the throne based on his descent from Edward III. However, some whispers at the time suggested that he might not have been the biological son of his own father, Richard of Konigsberg. If this rumor was true, it would mean that Richard III himself was not genetically descended from the Plantagenet line. He would have had no legitimate blood claim to the throne. This is particularly ironic because Richard became king partly by claiming that others lacked legitimacy. He declared that his brother Edward IV's children were illegitimate, which cleared the way for Richard to take the crown. He built his entire claim on the importance of pure bloodlines and legitimate birth. If the DNA break occurred in his own line, then everything he fought for was based on a genetic falsehood. Another possibility is that the break happened further back in the family tree, perhaps in the line connecting Edward III to Richard's father. This would still leave Richard's immediate parentage intact, but would show that somewhere in the earlier generations, the bloodline had been compromised. Medieval noble families were large and complex, with many branches and connections. Any one of dozens of births over several generations could have involved a false paternity. A third possibility is that the break occurred not in Richard's line at all, but in the ancestry of the modern Somerset family, who provided DNA samples for comparison. This would mean Richard's Y chromosome was actually correct, and it was the comparison group that had the genetic discontinuity. While this would preserve Richard's legitimacy, it would still prove the same fundamental point. Noble bloodlines were not as pure as everyone claimed. The truth is that false paternity events are more common than most people realize. Modern genetic studies that compare DNA to family records consistently find discrepancies. Research suggests that roughly 1% to 2% of births involve a biological father who is not the person recorded as the father. That might not sound like much, but over many generations, the probability adds up significantly. Across 19 generations, the mathematical likelihood of at least one false paternity event occurring becomes quite high. For ordinary families, this kind of discovery might be surprising, but not devastating. People find out about unexpected parentage through DNA testing all the time in the modern era. But for royal families, where everything depended on bloodline and legitimacy, this was different. The entire system of hereditary monarchy rested on the assumption that kings were born, not made. They ruled by divine right, passed down through blood. The DNA evidence showed that this was, at best, an oversimplification and, at worst, a complete fiction. The irony of Richard's situation became almost poetic when viewed through this lens. Richard had taken the throne in 1483 after declaring his nephews illegitimate. These were the famous princes in the Tower, the 2 young sons of his brother Edward IV. Richard claimed that Edward's marriage had been invalid, making the children illegitimate and unable to inherit the throne. He also spread rumors that Edward himself was illegitimate, supposedly the result of their mother having an affair. Richard used accusations of illegitimacy as a weapon to seize power. He had justified his entire claim on the principle that bloodlines mattered absolutely, and that any taint of illegitimacy disqualified someone from ruling. Now, 5 centuries later, science revealed that the very concept he had weaponized was fundamentally flawed. The pure bloodline he claimed to represent may never have existed in the way he believed. This discovery forces us to reconsider how we think about medieval power structures. Historians had always known that the official narratives of royal families were partly propaganda. Kings and queens controlled how history was written, at least in their own time. But most assumed the basic facts of parentage were accurate. After all, royal births were public events, witnessed by nobles and recorded in multiple sources. The idea that false paternity could occur and be successfully hidden seemed unlikely. The DNA evidence proves it not only could happen, but apparently did happen. It raises uncomfortable questions about other royal families throughout history. If the Plantagenets had hidden illegitimacy in their line, what about other dynasties? The Tudors, who defeated Richard and took the throne, based their own claim partly on bloodline. The Stuarts who came after them did the same. European royal houses intermarried for centuries, all carefully tracking bloodlines and inheritance rights. How many of those official genealogies would hold up under genetic testing? Some modern royal families have been subject to DNA analysis, and the results have sometimes been surprising. The question of legitimacy remains sensitive even today. Most royal families would be unlikely to volunteer for comprehensive genetic testing of their claimed lineages, precisely because of what it might reveal. For Richard III personally, the revelation added another layer to an already complex legacy. He had been vilified by Tudor propaganda, turned into a monster by Shakespeare, and spent centuries as one of England's most hated kings. Modern historians had worked to rehabilitate his reputation, pointing out that much of what was written about him came from his enemies. The discovery of his skeleton had been part of that rehabilitation, proving that some of the propaganda about his physical deformity was exaggerated. But now, the DNA revealed that he might have been fighting for a crown he had no genetic right to hold. It didn't make him more villainous, but it did make him more human. It showed that the grand narratives of royal legitimacy, the very foundation of medieval power, were built on much shakier ground than anyone wanted to admit. The scandal hidden in his genes was perhaps more subversive than anything his enemies had accused him of, because it undermined the entire concept of hereditary rule itself. While the DNA scandal dominated headlines and sparked debates about royal legitimacy, other scientific analyses were quietly transforming how we understand Richard III as an actual person. For more than 500 years, our image of this king had been shaped almost entirely by people who hated him. The Tudors, who defeated Richard and took his throne, had every reason to paint him as a villain. They needed to justify their own rule by making Richard look as bad as possible. William Shakespeare later immortalized this Tudor propaganda in his famous play, creating a character who was physically deformed, morally corrupt, and almost supernaturally evil. But science offered something different. It allowed researchers to meet Richard on his own terms, free from the bias of his enemies or the romanticization of his supporters. The bones themselves could tell a story that no propaganda could alter. One of the most striking pieces of work was the facial reconstruction. Forensic artists took a CT scan of Richard's skull and used it to build a three-dimensional model. Then, working with anatomical specialists, they painstakingly added layers to this model. First came the muscles, positioned according to the attachment points visible on the bone. Then came fat tissue, distributed according to the sex, age, and build of the individual. Finally came skin, carefully shaped to follow the underlying structures. The process is part science and part art, but it's based on solid anatomical principles. The shape of the skull determines much about how a face looks. The position of the eye sockets, the structure of the cheekbones, the angle of the jaw. All these things are fixed by the bone and can't be changed by the artist's imagination. Where there's room for interpretation, such as the exact shape of the nose or the fullness of the lips, the artists used statistical averages based on population data. The face that emerged from this process was startling. It showed a younger man than many expected, which makes sense given that Richard died at 32. The face was less severe and more refined than the portraits had suggested. There was a prominent chin, a slender build to the features, and an expression that seemed thoughtful rather than cruel. It was, in many ways, a handsome face. This contradicted the Tudor-era portraits that had depicted Richard with heavy features and a menacing scowl. Then the genetic analysis added even more detail. The DNA testing didn't just establish identity, it could also predict physical characteristics. Scientists analyzed genes associated with pigmentation, the biological factors that determine hair and eye color. The results were remarkably specific. The DNA predicted with 96% probability that Richard had blue eyes. It also suggested with 77% probability that he had blonde hair during childhood, which likely darkened to light brown as he grew into adulthood. This was a revelation. Later portraits of Richard, painted after his death by Tudor artists, had shown him with dark hair and a brooding appearance. These were clearly designed to make him look more villainous, playing into medieval associations between dark coloring and evil character. The scientific evidence showed a completely different image, a fair-haired, blue-eyed man who would have looked quite different from the propaganda images. The DNA analysis also helped settle the question of his physical deformity once and for all. Shakespeare had famously portrayed Richard as a hunchback, with one shoulder higher than the other, and a twisted spine that made him grotesque to look at. For centuries, historians debated whether this was pure invention or based on some truth. The skeleton provided a definitive answer. Richard did have severe scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine, but it wouldn't have produced the dramatic hump that Shakespeare described. Medical experts who examined the skeleton explained what the condition would actually have looked like. The curvature was in the upper spine and would have made Richard's torso shorter than it should have been. His right shoulder would have sat noticeably higher than his left, creating a visible asymmetry. He probably stood around 5 feet 8 inches tall, which was average for a man in the 15th century, but the spinal curve would have made him appear somewhat shorter. Anyone looking at him would have noticed something was wrong with his posture, but he wouldn't have had a large hump on his back. Crucially, the medical analysis showed that this condition wouldn't have significantly affected his ability to fight. Scoliosis of this type doesn't weaken the arms or legs. Richard would have been fully capable of wearing the heavy armor required for medieval combat. A full suit of plate armor could weigh 50 pounds or more, and moving in it required considerable strength and stamina. The evidence from Richard's skeleton showed that despite his spinal condition, he was physically strong enough to be an effective warrior. This leads directly to perhaps the most powerful story told by the bones, the account of Richard's final moments. The skeleton bears 11 separate wounds, and 9 of them are concentrated on the skull. This distribution of injuries tells forensic experts a great deal about what happened. In medieval warfare, soldiers wore helmets specifically to protect the head. The fact that Richard suffered so many head wounds means his helmet must have been lost or removed during the fight. The wounds themselves are brutal. One of them, almost certainly inflicted by a halberd, was a massive blow that came from below. It sheared off a piece of skull and drove deep into the brain. Another wound was a sword thrust that went completely through the head from one side to the other. Either of these injuries would have been instantly fatal. The other head wounds, while not necessarily lethal individually, show that Richard was subjected to a sustained attack on his unprotected head. Forensic analysis suggests these weren't random blows struck in the chaos of battle. The pattern and severity indicate that Richard was likely on the ground, possibly unhorsed, and surrounded by enemies who were deliberately targeting his head with multiple strikes. This was a concentrated, brutal assault. Some researchers believe the ferocity of the attack suggests personal hatred. Richard's enemies didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to destroy him. What makes this even more chilling is that the violence apparently continued after Richard was already dead. 2 of the wounds on the skeleton, a cut on a rib and a deep puncture wound to the pelvis, were almost certainly inflicted post-mortem. These are injuries that would have been difficult or impossible to inflict while Richard was wearing armor and standing upright. They suggest that after he fell, perhaps after he was already dead, someone continued to stab at his body. Historical accounts describe what happened next. Richard's body was stripped naked, thrown over a horse, and paraded through the streets of Leicester as a trophy. During this display, people would have been able to see and potentially inflict further indignities on the corpse. The post-mortem wounds fit this scenario. It was a final humiliation, a way of showing total victory and utter contempt for the defeated king. This treatment was deliberate. In medieval culture, how you were buried mattered enormously. It reflected your status in life and was believed to affect your fate in the afterlife. A king should have been buried with ceremony and respect, in a grand tomb that would preserve his memory and dignity. Instead, Richard was dumped into a hastily dug grave that was too small for his body, in an obscure friary, with no memorial or marker. His enemies wanted to erase him, yet in a twist that nobody in 1485 could have predicted, modern science gave Richard back the dignity that was taken from him. The analysis of his bones confirmed that whatever else he might have been, he was a warrior who died fighting. The wounds show he faced his attackers rather than fleeing. Even when surrounded and without his helmet, even against impossible odds, he kept fighting until the end. The catastrophic injuries to his skull prove he was looking at his enemies when they struck the fatal blows. This doesn't make Richard a hero or absolve him of whatever actions he took during his life. History is complex, and people are rarely purely good or evil. But it does restore a measure of human truth that centuries of propaganda had obscured. The Tudor narratives painted Richard as a coward and a monster who died as he lived, in treachery and corruption. Shakespeare showed him dying while shouting desperately for a horse, implying he was trying to flee. The bones tell a different story. They show a man who fought to the last against enemies who hated him enough to continue striking his body even after life had left it. The scientific analysis transformed Richard from a cartoon villain into a real person. We can now see what he actually looked like, understand the physical challenges he lived with, and know with certainty how violently his life ended. We know he had blue eyes and light brown hair. We know his spine was curved, but that he was still capable of wearing armor and fighting in battles. We know he died in a brutal personal assault, and that his body was treated with contempt afterward. Perhaps most importantly, we know that much of what was written about him was exaggeration or outright fabrication. The monster created by Tudor propaganda and immortalized by Shakespeare was never real. In his place, we have something more valuable: the truth about a medieval king, told through the evidence preserved in his bones and written in his DNA.